Friday night. The office was steeped in silence, broken only by the quiet hum of computers and the soft clicks of my keyboard. The digital clock read 9:17 p.m. It was way past time to head home, but I was still sitting there, determined to finish the final report for the big project. Everyone had left hours ago, leaving behind the faint smell of coffee and the eerie stillness of an empty office. I liked the quiet, until his voice broke through it like a smooth blade cutting through glass. "You take work way too seriously, Scarlett." I looked up, startled. Ryan was leaning casually against the doorframe, his tie slightly loosened, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He shouldn't have been here, not at this hour. But somehow I wasn't surprised. "Someone has to make sure everything is perfect," I replied, trying to sound indifferent. He stepped further into the room, his footsteps soft but deliberate, filling the space between us. "Perfection is overrated. But dedication? That's something else entirely." The air shifted as he moved closer. I felt his presence before I saw him leaning over my desk to look at the spreadsheet on my screen. Our shoulders brushed. Just a brief touch, but it sent a ripple through me. "I see where you're stuck," he said quietly, his voice low, as though this moment belonged to just the two of us. He reached forward to point at the formula I'd been struggling with, his hand brushing against mine. It was the lightest contact, fleeting, but it stayed with me like an echo. My breath caught. I glanced at his hand, then up into his eyes. There it was. That look. Intense. Unwavering. A pause. Too long to be innocent. I forced a smile, trying to break the tension. "Thanks for the help." But he didn't step away. His gaze lingered, searching for something beneath my composed surface. "You deserve more, Scarlett," he murmured. "More than late nights and endless deadlines." His words struck me like a spark against dry tinder, igniting something I wasn't ready to name. My pulse quickened. I could pretend his words meant nothing, but they did. I turned back to the screen, willing my focus to return, but the numbers blurred. His words stayed long after he stepped away, as if they'd been etched into the air itself. Suddenly, the office felt too small. And the space between us? Far too dangerous. When I got home that night, the familiar sound of plates clinking in the kitchen greeted me. Andrew was setting the table with his usual care, folding the napkins into perfect triangles the way he always did. The smell of garlic pasta filled the air, a comforting scent, but tonight, it felt oddly distant. I slipped off my heels and walked toward him, trying to shake off the remnants of that conversation with Ryan. His words still pulsed in my mind like a low hum. "You deserve more." "Hey, you're home," Andrew said, turning to me with his warm, predictable smile. He leaned in and kissed my forehead. "Dinner's ready." I nodded and sat down at the table. We began eating in relative silence, the only sounds the clinking of forks and the low hum of the kitchen fan. Andrew didn't notice at first. He was too busy telling me about a weekend trip he wanted us to take. "I was thinking we could rent a cabin by the lake, just us. No work, no distractions," he said enthusiastically, his fork twirling pasta as if he was weaving the perfect picture of escape. I forced a smile and nodded again. "That sounds nice." But my voice was distant, like an echo of someone else's. Andrew paused, his brow furrowing as he set his fork down. "You okay?" I blinked, realizing how far away I'd drifted in my thoughts. "Yeah, just tired. Work was a lot." He studied me for a second longer than usual, his gaze soft but curious. "You've been working too hard. Maybe the cabin is exactly what we need." "We." The word settled in my mind. Andrew always thought in terms of us, our plans, our future, our next steps. It should have been comforting, but instead, it felt like a weight pressing down on me. I watched him as he reached for his glass of water, his movements steady and familiar. Andrew was good, reliable, the kind of man you could build a life with. And yet, that same steadiness that once felt like a foundation now felt like a cage. Yeah, I murmured, taking a sip of wine to mask the unease in my throat. Maybe you're right. The next morning felt like an extension of the night before. Quiet, routine, and predictable. I slipped into a simple white blouse and tailored pants, my mind already racing with the day ahead. As I walked into the office, my heart skipped a beat when I saw Ryan leaning casually against the break room door, coffee in hand. His eyes met mine instantly, as though he'd been waiting. "Morning, Scarlett." He greeted me with that half smile that always seemed to hold something unsaid. "Morning," I replied. My tone clipped as I tried to walk past him. "Hold on a second." His voice was low, deliberate. I stopped, turning toward him reluctantly. "How do you take your coffee?" he asked, as if the question held more weight than it should. "Black. No sugar." He raised an eyebrow, his smile deepening. "Efficient. Just like you." He poured another cup and handed it to me without a word. We walked to the windows overlooking the city, the early morning light streaming through the glass. He spoke first. "Do you ever feel like you're just stuck?" I swallowed hard, unsure how to answer. "Everyone feels that way sometimes." Ryan's gaze didn't waver. "But do you ever think about changing everything?" His question hit me harder than I expected. The way he said it, so calm and yet so charged, made it sound less like a hypothetical and more like a challenge. I stared out at the skyline, the buildings rising high and sharp against the sky. "That's not something you just do." He leaned in slightly, his voice almost a whisper. "Why not?" The space between us felt like it was closing in, the air thick with an unspoken promise. I could have walked away. I should have walked away. But instead, I took a sip of coffee, letting the bitterness settle on my tongue as Ryan's words echoed through me. For the first time, the thought wasn't terrifying. It was tempting. The email came through at 10:12 a.m., simple and direct. "Lunch today? I'd like to discuss the project's next phase." Ryan's name at the bottom felt heavier than it should have. I stared at the screen, feeling my pulse in my fingertips as they hovered over the keyboard. One word. That's all it took to set things in motion. Sure. By noon, I was standing outside Montrose, a sleek restaurant with soft lighting and a reputation for discretion. It wasn't the kind of place for casual meetings. As I walked in, I spotted him immediately. Ryan sat near the window, his suit impeccably tailored, a quiet authority in the way he leaned back, observing the room as if it was his to command. When he noticed me, he stood up and smiled, a gesture that was both polite and devastatingly charming. "You're early," I said as I approached the table. He pulled out my chair, a subtle but deliberate gesture. "I didn't want to miss seeing you walk in." I laughed softly, but the heat rose to my cheeks. It was the kind of comment that could be brushed off, or dissected. I chose to brush it off. The waiter arrived, and we ordered quickly. Ryan leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table as the hum of conversation around us faded into the background. "So," I began, trying to keep my voice steady, "what's the next step for the project?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he studied me with that familiar, unshakable focus. "We could talk about timelines and budgets, but that's not why I asked you here." My breath caught for a second before I forced myself to exhale slowly. "Then why did you—" Ryan's fingers brushed the rim of his glass, a slow and deliberate movement. "I wanted to know where your mind is, what you want, not just in work, but in all of this." The weight of his gaze felt like it was peeling away every carefully placed layer I'd built to protect myself. I tilted my head, aiming for levity. "Isn't that a little outside the scope of the project?" He chuckled, a low, warm sound that somehow made everything feel more intimate. "Maybe, but I think it's important." Our food arrived, but the conversation hung between us, unbroken. As we picked at our meals, the silence became something else. Charged, heavy with meaning. When Ryan reached for the breadbasket, his hand brushed against mine. A simple touch, accidental by appearance. But I didn't move my hand. Neither did he. Time slowed. The world outside the restaurant faded into a blur of shadows and light. The only thing that felt real was the heat of his skin against mine. He didn't look down at our hands. He looked straight at me, waiting, daring me. I could feel the questions forming in the air between us. Was I ready for this? Could I even name what this was? I pulled my hand back, gently but deliberately. Ryan, this feels like more than work? He finished for me, his voice soft but resolute. I swallowed hard, pushing the plate away slightly. It's just a lot. He leaned back slightly, giving me space but not letting go of the moment. I get that. I forced myself to breathe. I should probably get back soon. Ryan nodded, his expression understanding but unshaken. Whenever you're ready, Scarlett. As we stood and walked toward the exit, I felt the weight of his presence beside me. The restaurant's glass doors reflected our figures, side by side, close but not touching. When we stepped outside, the afternoon sun was brighter than I remembered. Ryan caught my gaze one last time before I turned toward my car. In that split second, I knew this wasn't the end of whatever had started between us. But I wasn't ready to name it, let alone follow it to its inevitable conclusion. By the time I got home that evening, the sun had already dipped below the horizon, casting the house in a soft golden glow. Andrew was in the living room, lounging on the couch with a book in his hands, his glasses slightly askew. The sight was so familiar, so comforting, and yet I felt like I was seeing it from a distance, like a scene from someone else's life. He looked up when I stepped inside and smiled. "You're home earlier than I thought." I nodded, kicking off my shoes and setting my bag by the door. "Yeah, I wrapped things up quickly." Andrew closed his book and walked over, placing a light kiss on my cheek. "Good. You've been pushing yourself too hard lately." I forced a small smile as I leaned into his touch, but I couldn't ignore the twist of guilt that settled in my chest. He smelled like fresh laundry and home, everything safe and certain. And yet, the memory of Ryan's touch on my hand and the way his eyes had lingered on mine still clung to me like smoke. "Are you okay?" Andrew's voice pulled me back to the present. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just tired," I said quickly. He studied me for a moment, his brows furrowed slightly, but he didn't press. Instead, he ran his hand down my arm gently. "Let's order takeout tonight. You shouldn't have to cook after a long day." I nodded again, grateful that he didn't push further. "That sounds nice." Andrew disappeared into the kitchen to grab his phone, and I sank onto the couch, my body heavy with exhaustion. But it wasn't just from work. It was the weight of everything I was carrying inside me, things I couldn't say out loud. I stared at the framed photos on the mantel. Us at the cabin last summer, smiling at the camera, Andrew's arm slung casually over my shoulder. The memory should have warmed me, but instead, it felt hollow. The next few days passed in a blur of routine, emails, meetings, and polite small talk that felt as fragile as glass. But beneath it all, something restless churned inside me. At home, Andrew continued to be his usual self, kind, patient, steady. But it was that very steadiness that felt suffocating now. Every gesture, every word was predictable. I knew exactly how he would respond before he even opened his mouth. One night, as we sat side by side on the couch, Andrew reached over and wrapped his arm around me, pulling me close. I leaned into him automatically, but the warmth I used to feel in moments like this had been replaced by something else, an ache I didn't know how to name. He pressed a soft kiss to my temple. "You've been distant lately," he murmured. I felt my chest tighten. "I'm just overwhelmed with work," I lied. Andrew exhaled slowly, nodding. "Okay, but if something's wrong, you can tell me." I wanted to. I wanted to tell him everything. How I felt trapped in this perfect life we'd built. How I wasn't sure who I was anymore. And how Ryan had unraveled something in me that I didn't know how to control. But the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I whispered, "I know." At the office, Things with Ryan became more complicated. He didn't need to say much. His presence was enough to throw me off balance. Every time I caught his eye in a meeting or passed him in the hallway, I felt that same pull, the unspoken gravity that tethered us together, no matter how hard I tried to resist. One afternoon, as I was finishing up some notes at my desk, Ryan walked by and stopped briefly. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low enough that only I could hear. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Ryan's eyes searched mine for a long moment before he gave a small nod and walked away. But the air between us felt charged, as though something inevitable was drawing closer. That night, lying in bed beside Andrew, I stared at the ceiling, my heart pounding against my ribcage. I felt torn in half, the person I had always been, and the person I was slowly becoming. I turned toward Andrew and watched his peaceful face as he slept. He didn't know that my thoughts were miles away, in the space between Ryan's words and the way he made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. A quiet, terrifying truth settled into my mind as I drifted into restless sleep. No matter how hard I fought it, the pull toward Ryan was growing stronger, and I didn't know if I wanted to stop it anymore. It started with a simple question. "Do you want to get out of here for a day?" Ryan's voice was casual, but his eyes betrayed something deeper. "A little freedom?" The word freedom hung in the air between us, thick and tempting. I hesitated, glancing around at the papers strewn across my desk, at the endless to-do list blinking from my screen. Then, almost before I realized what I was doing, I nodded. "Okay." We drove out of the city early the next morning. The sky was painted in soft hues of lavender and gold, and the hum of the tires on the highway was oddly soothing. Neither of us spoke much at first. There wasn't a need to. The further we drove, the more the city's chaos melted away. The forest greeted us with towering pines, their scent thick and fresh, like a promise of something untainted. I rolled the window down, letting the cool breeze whip through my hair. "You look different out here," Ryan said as he glanced over at me. "Different how?" "Free," he said simply. I didn't respond. I just closed my eyes for a moment, letting that word settle into my bones. The trail was quiet. The only sounds the crunch of leaves beneath our feet and the distant chirping of birds. I felt strangely weightless as we walked, like all the heaviness I'd been carrying had been left behind in the city. "How did you know I needed this?" I asked after a while, kicking a small stone off the path. Ryan shrugged but smiled. "I just knew." We stopped at a clearing where the trees opened up, revealing a sweeping view of the hills below. The landscape stretched out endlessly, wild and untamed. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the cool, pine-scented air. Ryan stood beside me, silent but present. It felt as though the forest itself had conspired to wrap us in its stillness. We lingered there until the sun rose higher, warming the earth beneath our feet. When we finally decided to head back to the car, I felt lighter, but that fleeting peace was short-lived. The engine didn't start. Ryan twisted the key in the ignition again, but the car only sputtered in response. He let out a low curse and stepped out, popping the hood. I followed, wrapping my arms around myself as the breeze picked up. "Can you fix it?" I asked, peering over his shoulder. Ryan wiped his hand on a rag and shook his head. "Looks like we'll need to call for help." We both stood there, leaning against the car, watching the empty trail stretch out before us. "What do we do now?" I asked, half laughing at the absurdity of it all. Ryan glanced down at his hand, smudged with black grease, then wiped it on his sleeve without thinking. I couldn't help but laugh. "Really?" I raised an eyebrow. "That's your solution?" He grinned, looking down at the mess he'd made. "I never said I was good at this." For a moment, we laughed like old friends. No tension, no questions, just pure, unguarded laughter. But when the laughter faded, the air between us shifted again, as if the forest itself had quieted to watch us. I looked at him, really looked at him, the way the sunlight caught in his hair, the slight crease at the corner of his mouth. And then there was his expression, a mixture of curiosity and something more. He wasn't smiling anymore. His gaze softened as he stepped closer, his face inches from mine. Scalret. He said my name so quietly, it felt like a secret. I didn't move. His hand came up slowly, brushing a stray lock of hair behind my ear. His fingers lingered for a moment on my cheek, warm and deliberate. He was asking for permission without saying a word. I closed my eyes for just a second, and when I opened them again, he was still there, waiting. I didn't step back. His lips met mine, soft and certain. The world around us dissolved. No rustling trees, no distant hum of life, just the quiet thrum of my heart and the way he felt against me. It wasn't a desperate kiss. It wasn't reckless. It was everything that had built between us, slow and inevitable, finally unraveling. When we pulled apart, I kept my eyes closed for a second longer, as though keeping them shut might make the moment last forever. But as I looked up at him, I knew the truth. There was no going back. The line I swore I'd never cross was behind me now. And yet, I didn't feel lost. I felt awake. The drive back to the city felt different. The air between us was quiet, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that held the weight of unspoken truths. I watched the trees blur past the window, their shadows flickering over my face like passing memories. Something inside me had shifted. I wasn't sure what to call it yet, but I knew I couldn't fit back into the version of myself I'd been before. Ryan's hand rested casually on the steering wheel, his other arm propped against the open window. He glanced at me once or twice, but neither of us broke the silence. We didn't need to. I felt his presence as surely as I felt my own heartbeat. By the time we reached the city, the skyline came into view like an old photograph. Familiar but distant, like I was seeing it through someone else's eyes. Ryan pulled up to the curb near my apartment. He cut the engine and turned toward me. "You okay?" I hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah, I think I am." A slow smile spread across his face. "Good." I opened the car door, stepping out into the city's noise and movement. But before I closed the door, I looked back at him. "Thank you." He didn't ask for what. He didn't have to. When I walked into our apartment, the smell of fresh coffee and vanilla greeted me. Andrew was sitting at the dining table, his laptop open and a mug in his hand. He looked up, surprised but pleased to see me. "You're home earlier than I thought," he said with a soft smile. "How was your day?" I set my keys down and shrugged. "Busy, but good." I surprised myself with the honesty in my voice. It was good, in a strange, complicated way. Andrew pushed his laptop aside and stood up, walking over to me. He kissed my forehead gently and wrapped his arms around me. "You seem calmer," he murmured against my hair. I froze for a fraction of a second before forcing myself to relax into his embrace. Maybe I just needed some fresh air. He pulled back slightly and studied me. "If that's all it takes, we should go on that lake trip sooner than later." His words hung in the air, a reminder of the life we had planned. The dependable weekends, the carefully chosen destinations, the quiet evenings where everything stayed the same. "Yeah, maybe," I said, my voice distant. Andrew's eyes searched mine, but he didn't press further. He never did. He trusted me too much, and the weight of that trust felt like a slow ache in my chest. The days that followed felt like stepping between two lives. At work, Ryan and I fell into a rhythm, an unspoken understanding. We were careful, a passing glance in the hallway that lasted a second too long, a conversation in the break room that felt ordinary to anyone else, but was loaded with meaning for us. Our lunches became frequent, but never in the same place. Coffee runs turned into walks in quiet parts of the city, where the noise of the world felt far away. Do you ever think about just disappearing for a while? Ryan asked me once as we sat by the river, watching the water catch the late afternoon sun. I turned to him. All the time. He smiled, but didn't say anything more. We didn't need to label what was happening between us. It wasn't about defining it. It was about feeling it, living in it, even if only for stolen moments. At home, Andrew was as thoughtful as ever. He asked about my day, made me tea when I came home late, and held me in his sleep the way he always had. But everything felt different now, like I was living behind glass. There, but not truly a part of it. I started to notice the little things. How predictable his routines were. How he folded the laundry in the same order every Sunday. How he laughed at the same jokes in the same way. There was nothing wrong with him. There never had been. But that was the problem. I wasn't leaving because of something missing in him. I was leaving because of something missing in me. One evening, I stood in the kitchen, staring at the photos pinned to the fridge, the pictures from our last trip, the two of us grinning at the camera, holding hands. I traced the edge of the photo with my finger, wondering how something that looked so perfect could feel so hollow now. Andrew walked in behind me and kissed the top of my head. Lost in thought? I turned and smiled weakly. Something like that. He pulled me into a hug, his arms strong and familiar. And yet, instead of feeling safe, I felt trapped. As I rested my head against his shoulder, my mind drifted again, to the way Ryan's hand had felt against mine, to the way the forest air had tasted like freedom. The hardest part wasn't the lie I was living with Andrew, it was the truth I couldn't ignore anymore. It was a Saturday afternoon when it all unraveled. The apartment was quiet, except for the faint hum of the dishwasher. I was folding laundry at the kitchen counter when Andrew walked in, his face pale but composed. "Can we talk?" His voice was calm, too calm. I looked up, my hands still gripping one of his t-shirts. "Sure, what's wrong?" He stepped forward and placed something on the counter in front of me. My stomach dropped when I saw what it was. My phone, the screen lit with a missed call from Ryan. Next to it was a handkerchief, white, embroidered at the corner, the one I had lent Ryan during our last drive. "Why is his name on your phone?" Andrew's question wasn't loud. He didn't need to raise his voice. The weight of his words hit harder than any scream could. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I stared at the name on the screen, as if it was someone else's life flashing before me. "Answer me, Scarlett." I met his eyes, and that's when I knew. This was the end. I could feel it in the way the air around us had shifted, in the way the ground beneath me seemed to give way. There was no going back. "I can't do this anymore," I whispered, barely recognizing my own voice. Andrew's eyes widened, the hurt flashing across his face like lightning. "What are you saying?" I swallowed hard, feeling the burn in my throat. I can't pretend to be happy when I'm not. I can't keep living this life that feels wrong. His expression shifted from shock to disbelief. "So, that's it? You're just giving up? On everything we built?" Tears stung my eyes, but I refused to look away. "We built something beautiful, Andrew. But I've changed. I don't know how or when exactly, but I'm not the person I was when we started this life together." He stepped back, as if my words had physically hit him. His breathing grew ragged, and for the first time, I saw his composure crack. "You've been seeing him, haven't you?" I hesitated, but only for a second. "Yes." The word landed between us like a stone, heavy and irreversible. Andrew's jaw clenched, and he ran a hand through his hair, pacing the room like a man trying to escape his own thoughts. Then he stopped and looked at me, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite name. Grief, anger, maybe even guilt. "I thought I was enough for you," he said quietly. My heart broke at the sound of it. It wasn't about you not being enough. It was about me, needing something I couldn't find in this life. Andrew stood there for what felt like an eternity before he finally exhaled. long and slow. "I guess I should have seen this coming," he muttered, "but I didn't want to believe it." He walked past me toward the bedroom, grabbed a duffel bag, and started throwing clothes into it. The sound of the zipper felt deafening. I followed him to the doorway. "Andrew, I'm sorry." "Don't." He turned toward me, his eyes red but steady. "Don't apologize. Just be honest." I nodded, my chest tight with emotions I couldn't name. When he walked out the door, the silence he left behind was unbearable. I stood in the middle of the living room, staring at the spot where his bag had been. The echoes of our life together lingered in every corner. The photos, the souvenirs from our trips, the mismatched mugs in the cabinet. I walked to the mirror near the hallway and stared at my reflection. My face looked the same, but everything beneath it had changed. My choices had led me here, to this moment where I was finally free, but at a cost. A week passed in a blur of empty spaces and unfamiliar quiet. I hadn't heard from Andrew, nor did I expect to. The apartment felt too big, too hollow without him. I spent most of my time pacing the floor, replaying every decision I'd made. I didn't cry. I was past that. All that was left was the reckoning. On Friday afternoon, as I sat by the window with a book I hadn't touched in hours, I heard the sound of a car pull up outside. I didn't need to look to know who it was. Ryan's black sedan gleamed under the afternoon sun. I grabbed my bag and headed for the door. He was leaning against the car, his sunglasses pushed up onto his head. When he saw me, he straightened, his expression soft but questioning. "Are you ready?" The weight of the past week pressed against my chest, but I nodded. Yes. I slid into the passenger seat, the leather cool against my skin. As Ryan started the engine, I felt the faint hum of the car beneath me. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. The city blurred past as he drove, but I didn't care where we were headed. All that mattered was the sense of release coursing through me. I rolled down the window, letting the wind whip my hair. The world outside felt vast, open, uncertain. But for the first time in years, that uncertainty felt like possibility. Ryan glanced over, a small smile playing at the corner of his lips. "To new beginnings," he said softly. I smiled back, feeling the weight of freedom settle into my bones. To new beginnings. And with that, I let the past slip away as we disappeared into the unknown.